Alright, so horror is subjective. What terrifies one person may not even make someone else flinch. I believe all of us can agree on that. Having said that, horror, or rather good horror, isn't just about startling the player with creepy imagery or loud noises. It's one of the most cerebral genres of fiction out there that oftentimes provides us with an agonizing yet thought-provoking experience that sticks with us even after we've finished the story. Unfortunately, that's something we're seeing less and less of when it comes to modern horror games. In fact, these days it seems like there's this weird you scratch my back, I scratch yours relationship going on between game developers and the YouTube Let's Player community, in that a lot of recent horror games seem to be desperately trying to replicate the success of games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Slender by grabbing the attention of the likes of PewDiePie, Markiplier, and the rest of those dregs of society and getting as much free marketing as possible.
You know, and that is one of the things I have noticed too, is that, these horror games just sort of pop out of nowhere, and despite, whatever quality they might have, they show up on these YouTube channels and they become sort of overnight success stories, as we've seen with Slender and whatnot, despite them being very simple games.
But there's a disturbing trend of these YouTube-targeted games being overly reliant on cheap jump scares. After all, most YouTube personalities are superstars solely because they're terrified on camera. And a good jump scare is quite literally a schadenfreude money shot. Case in point, Five Nights at Freddy's, which, as a gamer who's been around the block with several horror games, I can honestly say it just didn't do anything for me. I would argue that it's almost like a sugar rush. Instead of eating, proper nutrition, it's a quick fix. And what happens is you get that immediate rush, the jump scare in this case,
right.
And what you're left with afterwards is kind of like a, kind of downer feeling. It's like, that really wasn't as fulfilling as I thought it would be,
Yeah, true.
Yes, it's like a bag of chips compared to a gourmet meal.
Exactly.
Because the experience itself really doesn't stick with you, because...
Yeah.
After playing most of these jump scare games, you can still walk about in the dark. While a game that actually does strike, fear into you, you come to that point where you have to look over your shoulder for about a few weeks, even during the day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That definitely happened with me in Silent Hill 3. That game stuck with me for such a long time after I finished it.
Oh, I know.
Whereas, Five Nights at Freddy's, I played it a couple weeks ago, and I really only played it for a couple days, and then I've never touched it since.
Well, the thing is Five Nights at Freddy's is a huge success, and a lot of people have, said it's, a great example of modern horror, I guess. While a lot of people who have grown up with more classic horror are kind of looking at it and going, is this really a thing? So I know Ken and Max have extreme differences of opinions on Five Nights at Freddy's from what I've heard from both of them, and I want to kind of get an idea of why there's this discrepancy.
See, the thing about Five Nights at Freddy's is that to me, personally, that game epitomizes that cheap disposable modern horror game trend that I talked about in the very beginning of this video. Don't get me wrong, the game definitely has some great atmosphere and plenty of creepy imagery, but that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of substance that makes you want to keep playing, but of course that hasn't stopped certain people from branding it as the scariest game ever, and building an entire fucking cult around it, which I honestly don't understand.
Well, really, if you as you progress into the later nights of the game, because there are obviously 5 nights to play through, if you pay attention to a lot of the more subtle things going on in the behind the scenes, you actually learn a lot more about the backstory than you normally would. I think one of the biggest strengths of Five Nights at Freddy's really is not only its ambience, but really all the little details sort of hinting in at what's really going on, behind the scenes. If you go into the later nights, you notice that the posters on the wall actually change. These things are subtle and minute differences, but newspaper articles sort of take these posters' place, where you learn about grisly murders that happened in the Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. This guy was dressed up as one of the characters, lured several children into the back, and then murdered them and stuffed them into the suits. And there are also subtle audio cues in the game as well. Freddy's laugh is just a slowed down version of a child's laugh, and before you die at the hands of Bonnie or Chica, the rabbit or the chicken robots, you actually hear this sort of raspy groaning sound that sounds like, somebody's last dying breaths as they struggle to hold on to dear life. And I think that a lot of those deeper clues are really what makes that game, even more terrifying.
Right, I do acknowledge that the devil is often in the details, and those details are essential for a great horror experience, but it's almost what I said earlier. Five Nights at Freddy's has a great premise, and it has all the makings of a great murder/vengeful spirit mystery, but it never amounts to anything. Because what you're suggesting here is that the animatronic animals, they're possessed by the spirits of the dead children. Okay, fair enough. Sounds interesting. Why are they trying to kill the protagonist of the game again?
Yeah.
It's never explained.
Into the trash bin the game goes.
Well, I don't feel that way about it, but I mean, I do see your legitimate complaints. Like, a lot of this stuff I kind of learned before actually playing the game. Like, I didn't know to look out for that stuff, because had I not known any of this, it would have just seemed like a very shallow, ooga booga booga jump scare experience. And people don't really look into the devil of the details like this, especially when you're compelled to, switch between different security camera footages, and, oh, you better watch out for animals coming into the room, oh, you better keep an eye out on the fox before he comes dashing down the hall at you. I mean, and it doesn't really help that the creator of the game has been notoriously secretive about not only the main story, but its inspiration.
I definitely have the same kind of impression that Max has. Great minds think alike. Sorry. I have the same impression Max has, that it is a very, very cheap scare kind of game. But then Kenny, to kind of bridge the gap here, Kenny showed me the game theory video on Five Nights at Freddy's, where it really gives, and I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet though, but it really gives a shit ton of extra depth to the game. But it's not something you'd find in the game necessarily.
Well, that's why it's game theories.
Right. And again, that's what I think is lacking in Five Nights at Freddy's, is a lot of the elements that make horror.
Yeah, and not just Jump Scare Simulator 5000.
Exactly. Right. I mean, if you actually do want to look for like newspaper clippings and stuff, I mean, you can probably start piecing a somewhat scary story together, but it's still missing a lot of the fundamentals of what makes good horror.
Yeah, like who's Mike Schmidt? Why is he at that restaurant for 7 nights a week, getting paid $120
for $120 or something like that?
Yeah.
Yes, because the paper clippings could have, or the newspaper clippings could have easily been incorporated into the game. Like, maybe you accomplish something and all of a sudden, oh hey, here's a newspaper clipping that's been slipped under the door. I don't know who did it, but okay, I'm gonna read this. Kind of like you would find different notes in the classic Silent Hill or even Resident Evil games that expand the world and give you a better idea of the bigger picture.
That would have actually been a lot more effective, honestly.
Yeah, instead of actually having it catch a glimpse of your eye, or you had to go look for it or something like that.
Exactly.
Because, like Kenny said, his first play around, he didn't even notice this until someone else pointed it out.
Yeah, and again, it's after Kenny sent me the game theory information, it did convey a sense of dread. It makes the game sound a hell of a lot scarier than my first impression of it. But again, you have to go kind of outside the game to get the fear, to set up the atmosphere, to set up the tone that really creates the genuine horror. And I'm trying to kind of find a way to cue Max on his list of what makes good horror.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, really, a lot of the work is done, because the player's mind really creates what's going on. As H.P. Lovecraft once said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown.
Absolutely, because, and I'll let Mel get a word in here shortly.
No, don't do that. You don't want the woman talking.
I'm hoping
we lose viewers' life from that.
I'm trying to get to Max's list of what makes good horror, though, but I do have to concur with Ken that horror is the sense of dread, the sense of fear, is a mind killer. It's the one thing that will always override human reasoning, because it's such a strong primal emotion. Being alone, being in the dark, a game like Slender in the middle of the day would not be scary because, again, it doesn't convey that sense of primal dread that all of us instinctually have.
Mm-hmm.
So while horror really is subjective, I think there are a few elements, that really always have to be present in order to make a really good horror game, or at least you can find a few of those elements to really make a good horror game.
Exactly. There's definitely some commonalities that we all share, regardless of horror being subjective.
Right, because people will no doubt accuse me of being dismissive towards Five Nights at Freddy's, But I've actually given this some thought, and I've developed a list, or even a formula, if you will, of kind of like the necessary elements in order for a horror game to work. The first item on the list is an interesting premise / setting that is conducive towards creepy stuff happening, creepy imagery, creepy sounds, or just, all sorts of unsettling things happening. Because let's face it, if you're taking a stroll through the park on a bright sunny day surrounded by bystanders, there's not really a lot of room for creepy monsters to pop out of nowhere and go ooga booga booga.
Yeah.
Well, you say that a bright and sunny day, it's kind of hard to get any sort of horror experience in general. But what I brought up, unless you were hallucinating. So what if you're actually playing as a person, you're going about your normal day, and suddenly these things start happening? No one else notices, but you do. And, as the days go on, these things get worse and worse, and then nighttime comes, and that's where things eventually hit their peak. So, atmosphere is great and all that, but how it's executed at first is what the everlasting impact will be with other people. Different people have different versions of what horror is. I've already mentioned this in our last horror podcast, and that's why there's so many versions of what horror actually is. What we see is terrifying, like the subtle and, discomfort and stuff like that. Other people are going to find that boring.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why Resident Evil got so famous in the first place. It had that action, but it still had that subtlety. It appealed to both people. They wanted to shoot zombies, but it was still terrifying, because of how subtle it was. And then, of course, over the years, Resident Evil started aiming more towards action and everything like that. To a point, it was just, it wasn't scary at all.
How the mighty have fallen.
Seriously.
But before we get back onto bashing games, again, we need to go over what makes scary horror.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I went off topic there. Well,
no, it's fine, because that's the reason why I said that there has to be an interesting premise, because, again, Guy starts hallucinating during the day at work and sees all this creepy imagery and whatnot, and he thinks that maybe it's just him, but then once comes nightfall, things exacerbate, and all sorts of creepy ooga booga booga stuff happens.
Exactly. And it all determines on the player itself whether, will they make it until daytime, or will they end up just going too insane to a point where they just end up eventually killing themselves,
Well, yeah, exactly. We've had a fear of the dark since the days of the cavemen, and I've seen this in a lot of games where, the goal is to last until the day comes, like...
Simon's Quest.
No.
What a horrible night for a curse.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was this game called Knock Knock where... really the goal was you were sort of trapped in this never-ending cycle of nightmares, and what you had to do was last until the day and sort of turn all the lights on in your house, but there were also these twisted monsters sort of following you all over the place. It was an interesting, if not confusing game, and that was one of the main aspects of what made it genuinely creepy, the darkness and the unknown horrors that lurked within.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Something that makes Amnesia totally unplayable for me is the fact that the monsters, you don't know where they're going to be. You get up to a door, you look at the door, and it's like, do I really want to open it? There might be something on the other side. And it's that total inability to know exactly what's going on that drives the fear. That's why I think that, for an example, Japanese horror is way more interesting than Western horror. Because Western horror always says there's always going to be these scary places. The old dark house, the dark forest, that kind of thing. These forbidden areas.
Oh, yeah.
Well, everything's dark.
And darkness helps, though, because, again, it kind of... It preys on the human fear instincts.
It's like the aesthetic setup in the old dark house. Really creepy movie from the 30s.
Exactly, but again, with Western horror, there's always forbidden places. You don't go into the dark house, otherwise something bad might happen. Whereas Japanese horror, for instance, something horrible can happen anywhere.
Oh yeah.
Silent Hill is a great example of that.
Oh yeah. Well, I can see where the Western horror is getting at, because that's a test of obedience. If you tell not to go somewhere, you have to obey. If you don't, you pay the consequences.
Yeah. Well, it's like, you tell little Red Riding Hood, never go off the beaten path.
And what did she do?
She went off.
Goes off the beaten path.
Exactly. And I guess that's why, Silent Hill is so unnerving as well, because, you go into seemingly innocuous environments, that you encounter in your everyday life, like a school or a hospital, or
The bowling alley.
Yeah, bowling alley, and you encounter like these deranged horrors in these innocuous places.
One thing to clarify is that the best atmospheres in horror games always play to the fear of the unknown. They usually consist of character isolation, unfamiliar locations, and vulnerability to the environment.
I'm not sure if you guys heard of the House series.
Yeah, the House series of Flash games.
That's a great one. That actually scared me for about a good month.
Whereas in contrast to Real Horror Stories, a game I fucking hate, The House, it's still one of those Ooga Booga games, though, but it has a little bit more subtlety to it, and you know something bad's going to happen when you start putting pieces together, but the House series, specifically House 2, weaves an unsettling mystery that gamers willingly suffer through to ultimately uncover or resolve. Whereas Real Horror Stories is disconnected and the horror is solely reliant on jump scare, and that gets really old really quick.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It does.
Predictability is the killer of fear.
Yeah.
Something becomes less scary when you already know what's going to happen.
Exactly. And whereas Amnesia, if you're walking through a old rusty castle and you don't want to open the door because you don't know if the monster's on the other side, that's genuine horror.
That's where the fear of the unknown comes in.
Exactly.
You don't know.
A compelling premise/atmosphere is definitely a good start, but by itself, it's not really enough to deliver an effective horror experience. Hence, the second item on my list is a well-written protagonist with whose plight you can identify with. A good example of that would be the first 4 Silent Hill games, of course.
Yes.
Right. Everyday man.
Yeah, you got like a writer, a clerk, a teenager, and a amateur photographer.
Exactly. People who have no military training, cough cough. People who are totally at the mercy of their own environments.
Yes.
You want empathy through adversity. You want to sympathize more with James from Silent Hill 2 because of his vulnerabilities and his plight, and thus you're more inclined to get immersed in the horror around the character. This is why putting Rambo in a Silent Hill game isn't suspenseful.
Of course, the interesting thing about horror video games, as opposed to horror movies or novels, is the whole immersion factor. In other words, regardless of who you're playing as, by default, you're already kinda right in the middle of this ongoing nightmare. As such, in some cases, certain horror games can even pull off the protagonist being just the player themselves.
Yes, exactly. I find that in my limited experience with horror, the best horror is where you are the character, because you totally get immersed into the horror. It's way more intense than constantly being pulled out of the game and witness what's going on with a third person. But in this case, it's more important than ever before that the situation or scenario that you find yourself in be compelling and relatable enough that you want to invest your time into it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But going back to the list, the third and final item on the list is potentially the most important one, because regardless of who you are, you need to have a compelling incentive or goal that keeps you going forward.
Yes.
Exactly.
Again, Silent Hill 1, you're playing as Harry Mason, you have a car crash, your daughter disappears, and of course it plays on that parent instinct where you want to find and protect your children from all the horrors of the world. Silent Hill 2, James Sutherland is at the end of his rope, all of a sudden he gets a letter from his dead wife, and any rational person in this situation would think that it's some kind of hoax or a scam or whatever, but because he's got nothing else to live for, he still goes back to Silent Hill in order to get to the bottom of this mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, you take something like Five Nights at Freddy's, and what exact goal or motivation does the protagonist of that game have in order to keep coming back to that fucking job?
$120.
I know, like...
Anything for money!
And I mean, like, really outside of the whole, fascinating theory that, Matt Pat introduces in his game theory episode on the matter, there really is no incentive. Like, you're not really ever told who you are, what you're doing there, or why you have to keep coming back for such a crappy pay.
Yes.
Like, there really is nothing that you can really use to identify what the motivation is.
Right, and I feel like the last two items on Max's list are kind of one and the same, is because, whether it's you as a gamer wanting to know what the deal is with, James Sutherland's dead wife, or, why you'd sit down in a game for, $120, it's...
Well...
It almost breaks the illusion, almost.
Well, I mean, there are some differences between the last two items on Max's list. Like, for example... Silent Hill 5, and I'm not going at this from a, oh, I hate this game, I'm going to tear it apart angle, but I mean, a sort of a deconstructive angle. You have Alex, I think that's his name.
Yeah, it is.
His motivation is to look for his brother. Okay, fine. So he goes into the world of Silent Hill. However...
Oh, no, he goes to Shepherd's Glen first.
I'm sorry. It's been a long time since I touched that game. But yeah, he looks for his brother in these horrifying environments. But as a character, while the motivation is sound, as a character, he's not very compelling because he's also a soldier. So he has, survival training to help him with these situations. So he knows how to use guns, he knows how to use weapons and hand-to-hand combat. So, the threats seem less credible, which is why I also have such a big problem with, the Resident Evil movies, because of the fact that, the main protagonist is
basically Neo from The Matrix.
Exactly. She's unstoppable.
Yeah, pretty much.
So she's not a very compelling character, and you have no reason to really fear anything.
Right.
Well, they're basically fanfics.
Well, yes. It's an excuse for the director to put his wife in, shower scenes.
Yeah.
But, to get back to Five Nights at Freddy's, for instance, though, that's where I think, like Max suggests, that's where the whole game kind of falls apart, is why are you going back night after night to an increasingly more and more hostile environment? It kind of throws you out of the experience just a little bit.
Yeah, it's how it starts and what pushes you forward will all determine on how it all ends.
Exactly. Whereas I think that if it was 5 hours at Freddy's, if you had a part-time job at Freddy's and there's no way out of the building for 5 hours, it'd be much more intense.
Oh,
right,
yeah.
because sometimes survival is a compelling enough reason. That's why, for instance, Slender, despite being a very simplistic game, it still works because it basically plays in that fight or flee instinct.
Yes.
You have no choice but to keep... the only objective in that game is fucking run. Because otherwise the monster is gonna catch you and he's gonna fucking murder you.
It all comes from the fear of death, though, because every other genre, it's always happy endings and stuff like that. Everything's going to be, it's all going to be alright. But the thing with horror, that always ends in a tragedy, unless you
get lucky.
Yeah, because people don't want things to end badly, okay? Because they don't want to live through all this and then have it all suddenly be all in vain, okay? It's a what if. It's an experience you're either going to live with or you take to your grave.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's the uncertainty again. In a Disney movie, everything's going to be all right. Whereas, Psycho, the original Hitchcock film, it killed the lead protagonist half an hour into the movie. You didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody's safe.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's what I love. Okay, it's uncertainties.
Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes, uncertainty can go into the motivation of the game as well, and let's go with what you suggested, 5 hours at Freddy's, so there's a motivation to have a part-time job, so each and every level is an hour, and if we actually had, I guess a much better way to present the story in that game as well.
Right, because all the conspiracy theory stuff, all the alleged backstory behind the game is interesting enough, but it never really seeps into the actual game. There's no mystery. You never get to the bottom of who the killer is caught, so, there goes the fucking mystery of that game. But had he not been...
Well, the backstory's there, but, it's not actually,
But it never amounts to anything. You never help
integrated into the main part of the game.
Right, but you never... See, I think it's a shame that they found the killer before the events of the game even happened, because if your task was to kind of put the pieces together and maybe figure out who the killer was and kind of, gain the... I know this sounds ridiculous, but sort of, gain the trust of the vengeful spirits by... trapping that guy in the pizzeria, so they get their revenge on the guy. All I'm asking here is for something, some motivation, some mystery, something to do.
Right. And I think
but you don't do that.
Yes. What Max is kind of describing, it sounds like Five Nights at Freddy's meets Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Find Frank, and we'll take him from there, and pull him apart with meat hooks.
Fear.com.
That's another one. But again, if you, I think that if we apply Max's list of what to do, we can actually formulate, and I actually want to use this as a creative experience, to formulate a stronger Five Nights at Freddy's game that would be genuine horror. Again, this is our opinion of what genuine horror should be, though, but I think it'd be a stronger game.
Well, not to mention there's already Five Nights at Freddy's 2 coming out, so it's not like he's going to take our advice or anything.
Well, no, I'm not saying to take our advice. I'm just saying that we're gonna create a more eerie and more interesting Five Nights at Freddy's game versus, vague clues on what happened and ooga booga booga.
Yeah.
That's what it all comes down to.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how do we start?
What I would do is I would change the gameplay up a little bit, and I would make it a cross between Slender and Five Nights at Freddy's.
So like you would walk around the pizzeria?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You'd walk around with like a flashlight around the pizzeria, and say like you're inside your cubbyhole, your security cam area, and it's the only place where you can be safe.
Yeah.
Now, to set the atmosphere, again, maybe you right at the beginning you get like the newspaper clip, which I think Five Nights at Freddy's does do. But you need to build up on that. You need to make it increasingly eerier. And
integrate it into the main story for one.
Right. You need to have the main story of why you're there.
Yeah.
And your motivations as well. So, are you down on your luck? Are you just a security guard, a new guy who's maybe the
Can't
kids
pay the rent?
Right. Maybe the kids were killed by a security guard, which makes them vengeful towards you because they're not going to discriminate from one security guard to another.
Well, yeah, of course.
Maybe you knew one of the kids.
Yeah, maybe that. But you gotta build up tension. You say like you're looking at the cameras, and all of a sudden, you see the Five Nights at Freddy's thing, robots, and then you look away, and then you look back, and all of a sudden one of them's looking directly at the camera.
Oh yeah.
Now I think Five Nights at Freddy's does actually do something similar to this.
Well, it does.
But then the animatronic animals just start moving almost immediately.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like you get the phone call from like the previous guard, who, spoilers, dies in the fourth night and has been dead this whole time. But, what happens is that, when you get the phone call, you switch on the cameras, nothing happens at first, and then when you get to the three animatronics standing on the stage, one of them disappears. It's not like one looks at you or anything like that. One just disappears. So it's like, oh crap, where'd it go?
Right.
Crap, someone stole it. I gotta get out there.
Now here's the thing. You have to be at the mercy of your environment. And you have to, I would make it so that, like, the camera security area is the only place where you can really be safe, but you have to keep going outside with a flashlight to get supplies, for instance, batteries for the flashlight, food, water, something like that. And meanwhile, these things are still kind of out there hunting you at random.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And perhaps they get smarter as time passes. Like maybe they get to the generator or something, and they cut out the power in your security booth. So you got to go out and explore the place with the flashlight.
Yeah, that'd be the last hour they cut your security booth, so you can't see where they might be at.
Yeah, precisely.
And that's the thing, you can still have that ambience. You can still have their disturbing noises that they make, but at the very least, it would actually be more effective because you're running for your life and you really don't know where they are. Because I think a fault of the game is that, it sort of gets predictable in the later nights. Even with the fox, it gets predictable. Because even though you may not know, like, when he comes out behind the curtains to run down the hall, once you see the curtains are completely open and the fox isn't there, you can still just switch off the camera and close the door without triggering his, death scene at all. So, I mean, really the most unpredictable thing about that is Freddy, because you don't really know like what his pattern is, but still, it's a predictable game, and I think, it would be a lot scarier if you actually did have that freedom of movement and, the increasingly difficult objectives.
Right, because the animatronic animals by themselves, they're interesting villains for a horror game, but by themselves, especially if you're not familiar with their backstory, that they're possessed by the spirits of these dead children, they're not all that fascinating and they're not all that scary. Because, as I mentioned, like, sometimes when there's nothing going on in that game, the developers try to, well, their excuse, of course, is that they're trying to build tension, but my interpretation is more that they're getting desperate. So when nothing happens for a long period of time, all of a sudden you get this slight static on your camera, and you have the showbiz pizza bear's face with a little bit of text that basically says, "I'm gonna get you.
Oh,
You'll
yeah.
see, sooner or later, I'm gonna get you."
The parts of the game that says, "It's me."
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I know
That's
which part you're
great.
talking about.
To quote Rich Evans, spooky.
Well, that kind of feels disjointed from the rest of the game, honestly.
Right, because originally I had no idea that the animatronic animals were possessed by spirits, so it's like, how does a fucking robot hack into my security feed and go into spooky messages?
Well, right, and if you didn't know about the possession thing, then you would sort of be lost. So if you knew that backstory, then you'd at least know, oh, it's a paranormal hallucination. Okay, great. But yeah, I do see where it sort of falls victim to a lot of the same, I hate using this term, tropes that a lot of modern horror games fall into.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So it definitely can do with a facelift.
Yeah, because the problem is that I think right now we're giving this game much more thought than the creator did. because the creator came up with an eerie concept. You're in this pizzeria and the animatronic animals are alive. Alright, great. What are we gonna do with that? Well, you basically get a night trap-esque gameplay where you gotta keep track of where the animals are, otherwise they're gonna creep on you and go ooga booga booga.
That's actually a great analogy, is the night trap system.
Yeah. Okay, so is there any kind of mystery to this? No, you just gotta keep track of the animals, otherwise they're gonna creep on you and go ooga booga booga.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, are we gonna explore why the animals are alive? What's going on? Nah, just, make sure you survive. Okay, for this night? Nah, for 5 nights. But why doesn't the guard bolt after the first night? What's keeping him there? See, it's a game. Okay, listen, all we need to do is have one of the animals creep on you and go ooga booga booga, then PewDiePie is gonna play that game, and we're gonna make loads of money because people like those cheap scares. No one will. Okay, look. To me, horror isn't even about the scares, because out of all the genres, horror is possibly the most one of the most highbrow and psychological ones, because it actually sticks with you after you're done experiencing this game or that movie or whatever.
Yes.
And meanwhile, stuff like Five Nights at Freddy's or Real Horror Stories, what it is, it's fast food. You consume this product and you immediately forget about it afterwards, which explains why people like watching those watch me get scared by this game videos. It's just schadenfreude. You enjoy watching this person pee their pants as they play Amnesia, but you forget about it afterwards. To quote Red Letter Media.
Yes.
That's what it is. Loud noise.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I think we should be careful though from here on out, because we're sort of like harping on the things that are wrong instead of like what could be done right. So
I think we already said what needs to be done right. You need to go beyond that concept of ooh, scary.
Right.
The jump scare concept, exactly. You gotta build the tension. You have to put a person. You have to play on the primal fears of being alone, being at the mercy of your environment, and having some reason to continue forward. Otherwise, you will die.
Yes.
Well, here's the thing though, but if you think about it, the situation itself, is actually quite terrifying. You imagine yourself, you recently got this job, and just this first night, all this stuff started happening. If you visualize yourself in that situation, it is actually quite scary. Of course, what we said with the problem was that we kept going back.
Right.
Exactly. And see, that's where I lose my suspension of disbelief, is the fact that there's so many holes, so many opportunities. If you're going to put yourself in that position, you have to be engaged in it. You have to be put into a life or death situation. You have to do stuff that you would rationally do as a human being.
Probably get paid a little better too.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. Is a webcomic that Mel and I have read said that why don't I just guard the Chuck E. Cheese from the outside? I mean,
no. Why do we have the fans on? Save up on energy and turn it off.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
No, why don't we just put ourselves in the costumes too and just disguise as one of them?
Why don't you just go on unemployment instead of going back to that particular job? I mean, the first night I'd be like, nope, fuck this noise. It ain't worth $100.
Exactly.
Yeah. It had a good start, but the rest of it just fell short.
Yeah. The nice thing about Five Nights 2 is that it actually addresses a lot of the problems present in the first one. It weaves the backstory a lot better into the main game, whereas the phone guy tells you about, the incidents that are happening at the pizzeria where the children are actually murdered by a guy dressed up as Golden Freddy. The game actually also ties in, little cutscenes where you're actually coming from the perspective of, one of the animatronics in the old restaurant from the first game, and you can actually hear it emitting a robotic scream as if somebody's soul is stuck in there. And finally, there are actually little mini-games, like 8-bit mini-games, that sort of lead you on a mystery, as to who this purple man is, who's killed all the children. It's really creepy. Then again, some of the problems are still there from the first game. Like, why do you want to keep this job for even less money than in the first game? It makes no sense.
if I were to make a horror game, it would be basically like a John Wayne Gacy type of person in a like a really really rundown beat up amusement park, and you're like 12 or something, and you're locked inside.
Oh gosh. Next episode of Gravity Falls.
Well, but it'd be like this. You're 12 years old. You're basically a kid. That's the premise. You're kind of helpless. Again, that's one way to play in horror.
Yeah.
It's nighttime and you're locked inside of this creepy amusement park. Okay, so bam, you're already isolated and it's dark. So you already have plenty of stuff working for you, and all of a sudden you start, collecting news or some tidbits or something that says that maybe one of the guys who used to dress up as one of the Mickey Mouse mascots.
Yeah.
One of the guys in the Mickey Mouse outfits was a notorious John Wayne Gacy type who killed and raped kids, and maybe even in that order. Now 3 words: House of Mirrors.
Oh
wow,
yeah,
that would be great.
Now
like,
you're
I can just
walking.
imagine going in there.
Exactly, you're stuck in this place. You can't get out. You're trying to find a way out. Maybe the gates change at random, so one gate might get you out, and maybe you might have to crawl through like a duct somewhere else. So you're forced to explore the level. You have no other choice. You have to explore the level, trying to find which way will get you out. And then you have this character. I mean, he could be a ghost. He could be escape from prison, whatever the thing is. And he just kind of walks around the theme park, and if you leave footprints in the rain or something, he'll find your footprints and start following you.
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's very Amnesia in that way, where you don't know exactly where this guy's at, and you want to try to cover your tracks as much as possible. Now here's the thing: is you have to get into certain areas to check them out, but the doors are rusty, so that produces noise, which draws the guy to you. And there's very few places to hide. And if you hide in the same place, like the locker, over and over again, like in
Outlast,
and The Fear Within, they start to wise up, and then they start checking the lockers.
Yeah, Alien Isolation does the same thing too, actually.
Exactly. So you're always constantly running from literally a predator. This is the oldest and most base instinct that a human being can have. And you're trying to find your way out. That's your motivation. There's something out there that's literally trying to kill you and or get you. Ugh. I mean, the hair on the back of my neck is standing up already.
See, why can't you? I don't know. Let's make this happen.
Yeah, why can't you just pitch that game idea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I could. I'm not that good of a programmer, so.
No, that's why I say pitch it to somebody. I mean,
I already am. Everyone who's listening to us with a little clipboard and going, "Oh, this is a good idea," yoink.
Yeah.
But again, this particular premise covers all the bases that we've been talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Interesting premise. A compelling character, a 12-year-old who's in peril.
You, basically.
Yeah.
I am 12.
And you have a compelling reason to keep going on. The most compelling reason, I would say, and that is survival.
Yes.
Yeah, and one more thing though, don't immediately go through all this and just have the ending to where you die anyways.
Yeah.
That is annoying. I hate that.
Yeah, but don't cop out at the end.
I mean, that's like the biggest slap in the face, It's like, what is all this effort even for if you just immediately die? I mean, you could do